It was a crisp morning in the heart of a busy urban neighborhood. Officer Dan, a seasoned patrol officer with years of experience in handling various situations, was on his usual route, driving slowly through the streets as part of his routine. It wasn't a particularly extraordinary day. The sun was hidden behind a blanket of clouds, giving the city a dim, muted glow, but everything felt somewhat normal, until he came across something he hadn't anticipated. As he made a turn down a narrow side street, something caught his eye. A small, disheveled dog was limping along the sidewalk. Its fur was matted and dirty, clinging to its emaciated frame. The dog was no larger than a footstool, with a scruffy coat that suggested it had been out on its own for a while. From a distance, the dog appeared weak, its movements uncoordinated, as if it had lost its sense of direction. It kept darting from one side of the road to the other, its eyes wide and filled with confusion. Officer Dan slowed the patrol car to a stop, instinctively reaching for his radio. As an officer working in this part of town, he'd seen his fair share of stray animals over the years. Some were simply lost, some were in need of food or water, and some, unfortunately, were more aggressive, likely due to the harsh realities of street life. Most strays would either run from humans or bark wildly, but this one didn't seem to react like that. The dog was jittery, panicked even, moving erratically, but it wasn't displaying any aggression, at least not yet. It wasn't the first time Officer Dan had encountered a stray, but this one stood out for a reason. He could see the desperation in the dog's eyes. There was something oddly human in the way the animal moved, as though it knew it was lost, and perhaps more than that, it knew it was in danger. The more Dan observed, the more he noticed how frail and small the animal appeared, but there was also a sense of alertness in its eyes that suggested it wasn't completely unaware of its surroundings. For a split second, Officer Dan debated whether or not to intervene. He had handled enough stray dogs over the years to know that it was often better to call in animal control and let professionals handle the situation. However, on this particular day, he didn't want to waste any time. There was a certain urgency in the way the dog was moving, and he felt an instinctive need to do something. Without thinking it through fully, he opened the door of his patrol car and stepped out onto the sidewalk. As he approached the dog, it noticed him right away. The animal froze, its eyes widening, and for a moment, it just stared at him. Officer Dan paused, assessing the situation. He had learned to be cautious around animals, especially strays, as they were often scared and unpredictable. He took a few careful steps forward, trying not to make any sudden movements that might startle the dog further. But it wasn't the dog's reaction that worried Officer Dan. It was the way it continued to stumble around, clearly in distress. The dog's fur looked like it hadn't been groomed in weeks, possibly months. It was thin, its ribs showing beneath the layers of dirt and grime. Officer Dan's heart sank as he realized that this was no ordinary stray. This was an animal that had likely been abandoned and was now living in a state of utter survival. Its survival instincts were kicking in, making it more skittish and unpredictable than normal. The officer's mind raced, weighing his options. He knew that trying to capture or contain a frightened animal could sometimes be dangerous, especially when it was in such an anxious state. The last thing he wanted was for the dog to feel cornered, which could lead to a defensive reaction. But the dog was moving erratically, darting in and out of traffic, putting itself at risk of being hit by a passing vehicle. The streets were busier than usual, and the dog was dangerously close to crossing into a lane of moving cars. With no time to waste, Officer Dan decided that he needed to do something now. He wasn't sure what else to do in this situation, so he reached into his utility belt and grabbed his pepper spray. The officer had carried pepper spray for years as part of his law enforcement gear. It wasn't something he wanted to use unless absolutely necessary, but he knew it could be a useful tool to deter aggressive animals if needed. As he moved closer, he spoke gently to the dog, trying to calm it. He had seen enough of these situations to understand that animals could sense fear, and if he wasn't careful, the dog could interpret his actions as a threat. Still, the dog's erratic movements made it difficult for him to get any closer. It was clear that it was terrified, and the more he approached, the more it seemed like the dog was getting ready to flee. That's when the officer made a decision he would later regret, In a moment of panic, fearing that the dog might run into traffic or lash out in defense, he quickly deployed a burst of pepper spray. The dog yelped and jumped back, clearly startled by the intense sensation of the spray. Its eyes watered as it stumbled, disoriented and in pain. The animal quickly darted away, retreating into an alleyway nearby, and Officer Dan stood there for a moment, breathless, unsure of what he had just done. As he stood there trying to process the situation, he realized that something didn't feel right. He hadn't wanted to hurt the animal. He hadn't meant to cause any unnecessary distress, but the feeling of relief he had expected wasn't there. Instead, he was left with a deep sense of uncertainty, questioning whether his actions had been justified. He hadn't fully understood what was happening in the moment, and now he was faced with the harsh realization that he may have overreacted. The dog, now clearly in pain and frightened, had stumbled off into the shadows of the alley, where it could have been hiding, nursing its wounds. Officer Dan stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where the dog had disappeared. He felt a pang of guilt. The animal hadn't been aggressive, it had been scared. And now, because of his decision to act quickly, he had caused unnecessary harm. But just as he began to question whether he had made a mistake, something unexpected happened. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, and he turned to see a figure approaching. It was a woman, walking briskly down the street toward him. She looked concerned, scanning the area as if searching for something. Her gaze settled on Officer Dan, and then, almost instinctively, she looked in the direction of the alley where the dog had retreated. She called out, her voice filled with urgency. "Buddy? Where are you?" At first, Officer Dan didn't recognize the woman, but there was something in her tone that suggested she had a deep connection to the dog. The officer's stomach churned as he realized that this wasn't just some random passerby. This was the dog's owner, and from the way she was calling out, it was clear that Buddy, as she called him, was someone very important to her. The woman's face lit up when she saw the dog's shape emerging from the shadows, but her relief quickly turned to confusion when she saw the officer standing there. Her gaze moved from the dog to him, and then she said, "What happened? Why is he like this?" It was at that moment that Officer Dan's heart sank. He hadn't fully understood what he had done in his attempt to control the situation, but now, standing before the dog's owner, he realized just how wrong he had been. This wasn't just a stray dog. This was a dog that had been lost and separated from its loving owner, and here he was, having caused it even more distress. His heart raced, and the gravity of the situation settled on him like a heavy weight. The woman's eyes, wide with shock and concern, met his. There was no anger in her expression, only confusion and sadness. Officer Dan didn't know what to say. What could he say? He had acted out of fear, and now he was face to face with someone who had just lost their pet. "I'm so sorry," Officer Dan muttered, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't know." The woman knelt down beside the dog, her hands trembling as she gently stroked its fur. She whispered soothing words, but it was clear that she, too, was shaken. As Buddy, the dog, slowly began to calm down in her arms, the officer realized that this encounter, which had started as an attempt to help, had instead turned into a lesson about haste, assumptions, and compassion. And little did he know, the moment he made that decision would set the stage for a powerful change in both of their lives. As Officer Dan stood there, watching the woman comfort the dog, a wave of guilt washed over him. The pang of regret gnawed at him, and for a moment he wasn't sure what to do. He could see the dog was in distress, its body trembling as it nuzzled into the woman's arms. But what struck him the most wasn't the dog's discomfort. It was the look in the woman's eyes. There was something in her expression that conveyed more than just concern for her pet. It was a mix of confusion, disbelief, and, above all, an unmistakable sense of vulnerability. She continued to speak softly to the dog, her hands gently brushing over its sore body, trying to reassure it. The momentary calmness between them felt almost like a quiet, sacred bond, and Officer Dan found himself standing there, an outsider to something deeply personal. He could see the clear signs of affection in the way she treated Buddy, as if this dog was not just a pet, but a cherished companion. In that brief moment, Officer Dan realized just how wrong he had been to make assumptions about the dog's intentions. The woman looked up at him, her eyes now softer, but still filled with an undeniable sadness. It was in that instant that Dan understood how much deeper the situation went. This wasn't just a case of a stray animal causing a nuisance on the streets. This was a story of loss, connection, and pain. The dog, Buddy, had clearly been someone's everything, and now it had suffered because of an impulsive decision made by someone who hadn't taken the time to fully understand the situation. "I didn't mean to hurt him," Officer Dan said quietly, trying to find the right words. His voice was shaky with remorse, and he wished there was something more he could do. He'd never imagined that his quick decision would lead to something like this. The woman didn't immediately respond, and Dan could sense that she was trying to process what had just happened. She looked down at Buddy, who, though still recovering from the sting of the pepper spray, seemed to calm under her tender care. "I'm sure you didn't," the woman replied, her voice soft but laced with a quiet intensity. "But you've got to understand, this is my Buddy. I've been searching for him for days. He's my family." Her words hit Dan harder than he expected. He hadn't fully realized until then that the dog wasn't just another stray on the street. This dog had a name. It had an owner who loved it. And now that owner was standing here holding her beloved pet, who had been hurt by someone who hadn't seen the full picture. "I'm Sarah," the woman continued, her voice now steady but still tinged with emotion. "I've been looking everywhere for him. I thought I'd lost him for good. You've probably seen him wandering around these streets. He's always been a bit of an adventurer, but never this far from home, and then one day he just vanished." Officer Dan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had no idea that this dog, which he had thought of as just another stray in a busy urban environment, had a story. He had no idea the woman standing in front of him had been through the agony of searching for her pet, not knowing whether Buddy was alive or dead. His heart went out to her, and he felt an overwhelming sense of shame for how he had handled the situation. "I'm sorry. I didn't know," Dan muttered again, his voice almost lost in the quiet air between them. "I should have realized." Sarah nodded slowly, acknowledging his apology, though her eyes were still focused on Buddy. The dog, now resting in her lap, let out a soft whimper. Despite the discomfort it was still clearly feeling, it seemed to sense that it was back in the arms of someone who cared for it deeply. Sarah continued to pet Buddy gently, her fingers running through his matted fur as she whispered words of comfort, words only the dog could truly understand. "I've had Buddy since he was a pup," Sarah continued, her voice quieter now, reflective. "He's been my constant companion through everything. When he disappeared, I didn't know if I'd ever find him again. I couldn't just leave him out here, lost and alone. I've been walking these streets, asking around, putting up flyers. Every day it felt like I was just searching for a ghost." Dan watched Sarah, his chest heavy with empathy. He couldn't imagine the kind of pain she must have felt, wondering if her dog was hurt, hungry, or scared, all the while not knowing where he had gone. But now, she had found him. Or at least, she thought she had. But the reunion wasn't as she'd hoped. Instead of joy, it was filled with pain, discomfort, and a harsh reality. Her dog had been hurt, not by some random accident, but by the very person who should have been protecting the streets. Sarah's gaze shifted to the officer. "I get it. I understand that you were just doing your job, but you've got to realize, he's not just some random dog, he's my family. And when you did what you didn't just hurt him. You hurt me too." Dan swallowed hard. He didn't know how to respond. He had acted without thinking, assuming that the dog was just another stray with no owner to be found. But now, standing here, facing the reality of his actions, he could see just how much he had underestimated the situation. "I never wanted to hurt you or Buddy," Dan said quietly, his voice filled with genuine regret. I acted in the heat of the moment. I thought he was a danger, but I see now that I was wrong. I'm really sorry." Sarah nodded, though her face remained somber. "It's not just about being sorry. It's about understanding the responsibility we all have toward the animals we care for and toward each other. It's easy to judge something or someone based on appearances, but in reality, we never know what someone else is going through. We don't know their story." Dan felt the weight of her words, and for the first time, he understood that the dog wasn't just another animal on the street. It had a life, a history, a person who loved it. And in that moment, he realized that he had failed to see that before he acted. He had assumed that the dog was just a stray without considering the possibility that it might be someone's heart and soul. "I know I can't undo what happened," Sarah continued, her eyes lifting to meet his. "But what I can do is teach others. I can share Buddy's story so that maybe next time someone else might think before they act. We need to understand that these animals aren't disposable. They have their own lives, their own personalities, and they're just as deserving of care and respect as any person." Dan nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. He had learned a valuable lesson in that moment, one that went beyond just animals. It was a lesson about empathy, about taking the time to understand the bigger picture, and about being mindful of the impact our actions have on others. And while he couldn't undo the pain he had caused, he knew that he could make a change in how he approached his work in the future. As he stood there watching Sarah continue to comfort Buddy, he made a silent promise to himself that he would carry this lesson with him, not just in his professional life, but in his personal life as well. He would learn to slow down, to take a moment to assess the situation, and to consider all the factors before making a snap judgment. Buddy, though still recovering from the pepper spray, began to relax in Sarah's arms. She whispered softly to him, her words soothing until the dog's body stopped trembling. The reunion, though not perfect, was a healing process in itself. And in that moment, Officer Dan realized that sometimes the most important thing we can do is learn from our mistakes and grow from them. For Sarah and Buddy, their story was far from over. It was a story of love, loss, and reunion. But for Officer Dan, it was a story that would stay with him for a long time, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts can have the biggest consequences, and that at the end of the day, it's the compassion we show toward others that truly defines who we are. As Officer Dan stood there watching Sarah comfort her dog, a flood of emotions washed over him. The initial feeling of guilt still lingered, but it was quickly replaced by something else, a profound sense of realization. He had made a mistake. He had acted out of fear and assumption, and now, facing the consequences of his actions, he couldn't ignore the fact that there was so much more to the situation than he had understood at the time. He had seen countless stray animals in his years on the force, some aggressive, some simply lost, and some in need of help. It was part of the job, responding to calls about strays, assessing the situation, and determining the best course of action. But here, in this moment, with Sarah and Buddy, he understood for the first time just how easy it was to overlook the deeper connections that animals had with people. For so long, he had viewed animals primarily as threats or nuisances when they wandered into public spaces. They were either potential risks to people's safety, or they were simply in need of rescue. But the idea that an animal could have a story, a history, a place in someone's life as important as any human relationship, that hadn't been something he'd considered. Until now. He watched as Sarah continued to soothe Buddy, whispering words of comfort as she gently stroked the dog's fur. The bond between them was clear. Sarah's devotion to Buddy was evident in every gesture, every soft word. As she held the dog close, Dan could see the intensity of her feelings. This wasn't just an animal she had rescued, it was a companion who had been there for her through thick and thin, a source of comfort and love in her life. The guilt Dan had felt earlier began to shift into a profound sense of self-awareness. In that moment, he understood that this incident wasn't just about a police officer making a mistake in handling a stray animal. This was about empathy, about learning to see beyond the surface and into the heart of a situation. The pepper spray, which had been intended to control a situation, had instead wounded not just the dog, but the relationship between an animal and its owner. It had violated the trust that existed between them, a trust that, as he now realized, was built on love and care. He could feel the weight of his actions bearing down on him. This wasn't just about fixing a problem in the moment. It wasn't just about resolving the issue and moving on to the next. No, this was a situation that required reflection. He needed to think about how he approached his role in the community, how he engaged with those who were vulnerable or in distress, whether they were animals or people. He had reacted impulsively, based on the instinct to maintain control. But what he hadn't considered was the deeper emotional impact of his actions and how much those actions could affect the lives of those around him. As Sarah continued to gently comfort Buddy, she glanced up at Officer Dan. Her eyes, though soft with understanding, still held a trace of sorrow. It wasn't anger, but it was a quiet sadness that he couldn't ignore. She had lost her companion, her family member, and even though she had found him again, the situation had been tainted by his interference. Dan could see that it wasn't just about the dog being hurt, it was about the violation of a trust. She had been searching for Buddy, walking the streets in desperation, not knowing if he was dead or alive. And now, the reunion she had longed for had been marred by pain. "I know you didn't mean to hurt him," Sarah said after a long pause, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I know that. But sometimes, you have to understand. Things are more complicated than they seem. Buddy is more than just a dog to me. He's been my companion for so long. I've spent years with him, and he's always been there, through everything." Officer Dan nodded silently. He had never fully understood the depth of the relationship between an animal and its owner. Sure, he had seen people walk their dogs, pet them, or take them to the vet. But he hadn't realized that for some, these animals weren't just pets. They were lifelines. They were sources of comfort, of unconditional love. They were there through difficult times, offering companionship and solace when words couldn't provide the same support. As Sarah spoke, she revealed more about the bond she had with Buddy, how he had been there through every major life event. She talked about how she had rescued him as a puppy, how they had grown up together. There was a sense of history in her words, a sense of shared experiences. It wasn't just about the dog being a part of her life. It was about the way that Buddy had shaped her life, how their shared moments had woven together in a beautiful, complicated story. "I've been through a lot in the last few years," Sarah continued, her voice softening as she looked down at Buddy. "There's been some tough stuff, things I didn't think I'd make it through. But Buddy was always there. He never judged me. He was just there, ready to listen when I needed to talk, or to sit with me when I didn't know what to say. He never left my side. He's been my rock. Losing him, it was like losing a piece of myself." Her words struck Dan deeply. He hadn't thought about it that way before. For him, Buddy was just another animal in the street, another case to handle. But for Sarah, Buddy was a lifeline, someone who had been there for her in ways that no human could. Dan had never considered the possibility that the stray animals he encountered might be tied to someone's heart in such an intimate way. It was a powerful reminder of how interconnected all lives were, and how sometimes in the rush to fix a situation, we overlooked the emotional weight that came with it. "I understand now," Dan said quietly, his voice carrying a sense of sincerity that hadn't been there when he first approached Sarah and Buddy. "I never thought about it that way. I never understood the depth of that kind of bond. I can't undo what I did, but I can learn from it." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "I appreciate that, officer. I really do. But it's important that people understand. Animals are more than just things to be handled. They have lives, they have feelings. They're not just objects. They're family. And when we treat them like they're disposable, like they don't matter, we lose sight of what really matters." Dan took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling within him. He knew she was right. He had been so focused on his role as an officer, on making sure that the situation didn't escalate, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. He had failed to see the love, the trust, and the history that Sarah and Buddy shared. He had failed to see the way that this little dog was a part of something much larger than himself. For the rest of the day, Officer Dan couldn't shake the thoughts that had flooded his mind. He replayed the incident over and over, each time understanding more deeply the mistakes he had made. He had acted hastily, not giving enough thought to the situation or the individuals involved. He had let fear dictate his actions, rather than taking the time to think things through. But as he reflected on the encounter, he also felt a sense of gratitude. He had learned something important, not just about animals, but about the power of compassion, understanding, and the need to take a step back before jumping into a decision. He had learned that, in his line of work, it wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about being present, being aware, and recognizing the humanity, or animality, in every situation. Later that evening, Officer Dan made a promise to himself. He promised to never again make assumptions about the animals he encountered on the job. He promised to take the time to understand their stories, to recognize the emotional bonds that people shared with their pets, and to approach each situation with more care and compassion. The lesson he had learned from Sarah and Buddy would stay with him, shaping his future actions and decisions. For Sarah, this experience had been painful, but it had also opened her eyes to something she hadn't considered. She realized that people, just like animals, could make mistakes. But as long as there was room for learning and growth, there was hope for redemption. She had forgiven Officer Dan, understanding that his actions hadn't come from a place of malice, but from a place of concern, albeit misguided. In the end, this was a story not just of a dog, a woman, and a police officer. It was a story of connection, of learning from one's mistakes, and of the power of empathy. And though the scars from that day would remain, both on Buddy and in Officer Dan's heart, they would serve as a reminder of the lessons learned. Lessons that would ultimately make all of them better for it. As Sarah spoke, she revealed more about the bond she had with Buddy, how he had been there through every major life event. She talked about how she had rescued him as a puppy, how they had grown up together. There was a sense of history in her words, a sense of shared experiences. It wasn't just about the dog being a part of her life. It was about the way that Buddy had shaped her life, how their shared moments had woven together in a beautiful, complicated story. "I've been through a lot in the last few years," Sarah continued, her voice softening as she looked down at Buddy. "There's been some tough stuff, things I didn't think I'd make it through. But Buddy was always there. He never judged me. He was just there, ready to listen when I needed to talk or to sit with me when I didn't know what to say. He never left my side. He's been my rock. Losing him, it was like losing a piece of myself." Her words struck Dan deeply. He hadn't thought about it that way before. For him, Buddy was just another animal in the street, another case to handle. But for Sarah, Buddy was a lifeline, someone who had been there for her in ways that no human could. Dan had never considered the possibility that the stray animals he encountered might be tied to someone's heart in such an intimate way. It was a powerful reminder of how interconnected all lives were, and how sometimes, in the rush to fix a situation, we overlook the emotional weight that came with it. "I understand now," Dan said quietly, his voice carrying a sense of sincerity that hadn't been there when he first approached Sarah and Buddy. "I never thought about it that way. I never understood the depth of that kind of bond. I can't undo what I did, but I can learn from it." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "I appreciate that, officer. I really do. But it's important that people understand. Animals are more than just things to be handled. They have lives. They have feelings. They're not just objects. They're family. And when we treat them like they're disposable, like they don't matter, we lose sight of what really matters." Dan took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling within him. He knew she was right. He had been so focused on his role as an officer, on making sure that the situation didn't escalate, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. He had failed to see the love, the trust, and the history that Sarah and Buddy shared. He had failed to see the way that this little dog was a part of something much larger than himself. For the rest of the day, Officer Dan couldn't shake the thoughts that had flooded his mind. He replayed the incident over and over, each time understanding more deeply the mistakes he had made. He had acted hastily, not giving enough thought to the situation or the individuals involved. He had let fear dictate his actions, rather than taking the time to think things through. But as he reflected on the encounter, he also felt a sense of gratitude. He had learned something important, not just about animals, but about the power of compassion, understanding, and the need to take a step back before jumping into a decision. He had learned that, in his line of work, it wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about being present, being aware, and recognizing the humanity, or animality, in every situation. Later that evening, Officer Dan made a promise to himself. He promised to never again make assumptions about the animals he encountered on the job. He promised to take the time to understand their stories, to recognize the emotional bonds that people shared with their pets, and to approach each situation with more care and compassion. The lesson he had learned from Sarah and Buddy would stay with him, shaping his future actions and decisions. For Sarah, this experience had been painful, but it had also opened her eyes to something she hadn't considered. She realized that people, just like animals, could make mistakes. But as long as there was room for learning and growth, there was hope for redemption. She had forgiven Officer Dan, understanding that his actions hadn't come from a place of malice, but from a place of concern, albeit misguided. In the end, this was a story not just of a dog, a woman, and a police officer. It was a story of connection, of learning from one's mistakes, and of the power of empathy. And though the scars from that day would remain, both on Buddy and in Officer Dan's heart, they would serve as a reminder of the lessons learned, lessons that would ultimately make all of them better for it. The days following the incident were filled with a range of emotions for both Officer Dan and Sarah. What had started as a simple mistake on the part of the officer had turned into a life-changing lesson for both of them. Dan found himself thinking back to that moment every time he got into his patrol car. He reflected on the judgment he had made, the assumption that the stray dog was a potential danger, and how that assumption had caused harm. It had caused harm not only to the dog, but to a woman who had spent days, weeks even, searching for her beloved companion. And for the first time in his career, Dan truly understood the weight of his actions. For Sarah, the incident had brought back all the pain and uncertainty she had felt when Buddy went missing. She had never expected that their reunion would be overshadowed by such a traumatic experience. It was hard to put into words the devastation she felt when she saw her dog in pain, all because someone had acted out of fear. But as time passed, the initial anger and hurt began to fade, replaced by something else, a quiet understanding. She realized that while Dan had made a mistake, he had also shown genuine remorse. And in the end, that mattered more than the mistake itself. Over the next week, Sarah and Officer Dan found themselves crossing paths a few more times. Each time, their interaction was more meaningful, more reflective. Dan had taken the time to research more about animal behavior, learning how important it was to approach animals, especially strays, with a calm and understanding demeanor. He learned that fear often led to aggression, and animals could feel the energy of the person approaching them. What had started as a quick, reactive decision had now turned into an opportunity for personal growth. He was no longer just looking at the world through the lens of his badge. He was looking at it with empathy. Sarah, too, had been reflecting on the events. She had spent many nights thinking about the way she had reacted to the situation. When she had first seen Dan standing there, she had been angry, feeling as though the officer had unjustly hurt her dog. But now, after having time to process everything, she understood that the officer had acted out of instinct. He had not known Buddy was her dog, and in his mind, he was trying to prevent the dog from running into traffic or potentially causing harm to others. In that moment, she had been so consumed with her own pain and fear that she had not been able to see the officer's perspective. But as time passed, her anger softened, and she found it within herself to forgive him. Sarah had learned something valuable through the experience as well. She realized that, much like with any other relationship, Communication and understanding were key. At first, she had been so focused on her own emotions, her own grief, that she hadn't stopped to think about what Dan might be feeling or thinking. She had assumed he was acting out of malice, when in fact, he had been trying to handle a difficult situation in the best way he knew how. It had been an eye-opening moment for her, one that reminded her that no one could truly understand what another person was going through until they took the time to listen. As the days went by, Buddy seemed to recover physically from the pepper spray incident. His eyes were no longer bloodshot and he moved with more ease. But emotionally, it was clear that the incident had left its mark. Buddy was more hesitant around strangers now, a little more cautious when approached by anyone outside of Sarah. It was heartbreaking for Sarah to see her dog, who had always been so trusting and loving, now unsure of people. It was a reminder that animals, like people, could be deeply affected by traumatic experiences. And while Buddy would eventually return to being his old self, it would take time and patience. One afternoon, Sarah decided to take Buddy to the park. It had become a sort of ritual for them, a place where they could escape the weight of the world, where Buddy could run and play and enjoy the simple things in life. But this time, Sarah wasn't sure how Buddy would react to the open space, to the unfamiliar people and dogs that often filled the park. As she walked toward the entrance, Buddy tugged at the leash, his tail wagging slightly. It was a good sign. But as they entered the park, and the sounds of children playing and dogs barking filled the air, Sarah could feel Buddy tense up. He kept looking over his shoulder, his body stiff as he tried to make sense of the environment. It was as if he had forgotten how to feel safe in places he once loved. Sarah sat on a bench, watching as Buddy slowly adjusted to his surroundings. She gently rubbed his back, speaking softly to him, reassuring him that everything was okay. She knew it would take time, but she had faith that Buddy would return to his playful, loving self again. After all, this was the same dog who had helped her through so many difficult moments in her life. He was resilient, and she knew he would heal, in his own time. As Sarah sat there, she couldn't help but think about the officer, about how much he had meant to her and Buddy's journey. She had forgiven him, and she realized that in forgiving him, she had also learned something about herself. She had learned the importance of understanding others, of recognizing that everyone makes mistakes, and that, sometimes, those mistakes can lead to growth and change. It wasn't about the incident anymore. It was about how they both had learned to see each other as human beings, as people with their own struggles, their own fears, and their own ways of coping with difficult situations. A few days later, Officer Dan found himself driving through the park on his usual patrol route. As he passed by the entrance, he saw Sarah and Buddy sitting on the bench. He slowed the car and pulled over, taking a deep breath before stepping out. He had been thinking about Sarah and Buddy a lot lately, and he knew this moment was coming. He had been hesitant to approach her again, unsure of how she would feel. But as he watched them from a distance, something told him that this was the right time. "Hey there," he said, walking toward them with a small, tentative smile. Sarah looked up, her face lighting up with a warm, genuine smile. She had come to appreciate the officer's willingness to learn and grow from the incident. "Hey, Officer Dan, how's it going?" "I'm doing okay," Dan replied, glancing at Buddy, who was now resting his head on Sarah's lap. "How about you two? How's Buddy doing?" "He's getting better," Sarah said, rubbing Buddy's ears. "He's still a little cautious, but we're working through it. It's going to take time, but he's resilient. He'll be all right." Dan nodded, his heart swelling with admiration for the bond between them. "I'm really glad to hear that. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I just wanted to say again how sorry I am for what I did. I hope you both know that it was never my intention to hurt Buddy. I was just trying to do what I thought was best in the moment." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes meeting his with understanding. I know, Dan, and I've forgiven you. I understand now that you were just trying to do your job. It's not easy, especially when you're dealing with animals who are scared and unpredictable. I've been thinking about it a lot too, and I realize that none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them and do better next time. Dan was surprised by her response. He had expected some lingering tension, maybe even some residual anger. But instead, he found understanding, a sense of mutual respect that had grown between them over the past few days. It was clear that both of them had come to terms with what had happened, and they had both emerged from the experience stronger, more empathetic, and more aware of their own actions. You know, Sarah continued, what I've learned from all of this is that we have to be more mindful of the animals around us. They're not just creatures that exist in our world. They're part of our lives, our families, and we have to treat them with the same care and respect that we give to each other. Dan nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude for this unexpected lesson. You're right, he said. I've learned a lot from this too, and I'm going to make sure that I never forget what it means to approach a situation with more understanding and care. As the two of them sat there, talking about their experiences and reflecting on the lessons they had learned, Buddy slowly lifted his head, his tail wagging just a little bit more. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to show that he was on his way to healing. And in that moment, Dan realized that sometimes the smallest acts, whether it's a moment of forgiveness, a gesture of understanding, or a commitment to change, can lead to the most meaningful growth. They sat together for a while, sharing stories, laughter, and a newfound sense of respect for one another. And as Dan finally got up to leave, he looked at Sarah and Buddy one last time, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't felt before. He had made a mistake, yes, but in learning from it, he had come to understand something far greater, that compassion, patience, and understanding are not just important in law enforcement, they are essential in life. As Dan drove away, he realized that he was no longer just the officer who sprayed a dog with pepper spray. He was a person who had learned a valuable lesson, and he would carry that lesson with him forever. Remember, every act of kindness counts, no matter how small. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Let's keep spreading compassion.